Hey everyone, today I thought I would give my take on metamodern Christianity. Given as I can't write at the moment, and people seem to be enjoying these sorts of personal reflections on these topics, I thought, why not? I also felt like going forward, having my view of these sorts of things out there is probably important because I'll be talking to a number of people over the following weeks about this topic, about Christianity, metamodern forms of Christianity, etc. And certainly so far in the conversation, I haven't had an occasion to express my kind of full views on the topic, but have sort of taken more kind of the modernist role in the dialectic with the traditional, and that's a very incomplete picture of my perspective. So, for what it's worth, I thought I'd throw this out there. Yeah, okay, so let's dive in. Well, first of all, I'm framing this as a metamodern Christianity. So we have to get some sense of what we mean by both of those terms, metamodern Christianity. I'll link some videos I've made on metamodernism. Uh, I'll also note that I wrote a book recently called Metamodernism or the Cultural Logic of Cultural Logics. So I've been pretty deeply engaged with that paradigm for a while, and this isn't the opportunity to present any kind of comprehensive vision of the metamodern paradigm. But just for the sake of this presentation, some working idea of what it is I'm talking about seems necessary. So let me just throw this out there that when I talk about the metamodern, I'm referring to a postmodern paradigm uh, that takes seriously the previous paradigms that have come before it, including the postmodern, but also the modern and also the pre-modern. There are different ways of conceptualizing that, whether there's this oscillation between these different perspectives or superposition, or I like to use the language of toggling between these different views. But in some, there's some notion in which the different perspectives of traditional, modern, postmodern are sort of simultaneously engaged in a way that produces sort of a productive new synergy among all these different things. So for my view, metamodernism is sort of a progressive movement beyond postmodernism that at the same time engages still with postmodernism and all of the previous forms of the modern and the pre-modern. So with if it's not doing that adequately, successfully, completely, then I think it's very problematic to think of it as metamodern. So that means that whatever conception of Christianity then we're going to be dealing with here has to fold all of those different perspectives into the mix and somehow do justice to them. At the same time, obviously, nothing can be nothing can be everything, right? So, in the fact that it's a metamodern perspective, it's not going to just be a traditional perspective or just a modern perspective. So, when you bring these together, you are invariably altering them or transforming them in the process. And so the metamodern perspective includes, but it's also different from those different modes. Um, so that's essentially what I'm going to try to do today is briefly offer one conception of meta-modern Christianity. Another thing I'll emphasize about meta-modernism is that in sort of relating these different perspectives or modes or worldviews or cultural logics together, attempts to move beyond just a relativistic framing of them, right? Postmodernism is itself a kind of worldview of worldviews, but it is so by the way that it doesn't affirm any particular worldview over another, at least explicitly, which leads to a kind of radical relativization. So you have your worldview, I have mine, et cetera, et cetera. And this creates obviously a lot of problems. One of the things that metamodernism is attempting to do in its different forms is to find a way beyond that kind of relativization to create a kind of coherence or coordination of these different worldviews. Um, in such a way that, yeah, brings back a sense of kind of, qualified progress, development, what have you. There is a sort of relationship that makes these things intelligible and can allow you to relate these things to each other. And in the version of metamodernism that speaks a lot to me and which I find the most compelling and convincing, these are a sort of developmental sequence that the pre-modern leads to the modern, which leads to the postmodern, which leads to the metamodern. And this can be thought of itself many different ways, dialectically and psychologically, etc. I won't get into all the details, but I do think that that's important. So what are we attempting to do? We're attempting to take seriously the traditional and the modern and the postmodern in a way that also recognizes that these are a sort of sequence of progressively more comprehensive visions of reality. So all are necessary and have been necessary, but that you get new things from each modality and perspective. You also get new pathologies, new problems, right? So the metamodern is attempting to integrate the best of what's been, but also to avoid the pitfalls and the problems of these previous worldviews. I'll just leave it there for now because there's obviously a lot more that could be said, but that is my conception of the metamodern that I'll be working with here. And so, okay, Christianity. Obviously, that's a much more, let's say, difficult thing to define, and I won't really make any attempt to do that here. But I will try to outline the sort of contours of what I think any ongoing robust form of Christianity has to sort of include if it's going to exhibit real continuity with its history, with its tradition. So I'll take a stab at trying to frame a certain expression of Christianity in a way that I feel like can be sort of meta-modernized. And to that end, I guess I would say the following: that I think Christianity it represents reality as a sort of divine drama. I think that's very important. Reality is not just sort of a purposeless, meandering, random accident. It has a purpose, it has a direction, has value, has meaning, and this is a story essentially to reality. Reality exhibits a kind of narrative, a sacred narrative, or it's been called sacred history, and and that we and that story is essentially what we get in Scripture. That the biblical tradition is a sort of repository for the unfolding narrative of the divine drama, such as it relates essentially a developing relationship between God and man across different uh, periods, different covenants, different dispensations, however you want to think about that. But that this is a relationship between God and man that's been unfolding, developing, changing, and has a certain directionality to it that is profoundly meaningful. Now, the essential kind of movement or plot line of that story is one of separation from God and kind of restoration to communion with God. So the basic movement is from separation to communion, or from sort of a kind of like radical religious alienation from the divine to a kind of healing reconciliation unity, however you want to frame that specifically in terms of the different language you could use, but that is sort of the broad arc of the sacred history, and the pivotal moment for that arc comes with the incarnation, death and resurrection of Jesus in historical time that precipitates the means by which the sort of reconnection with the divine can occur. So that's kind of my framing of what I will say we mean by Christianity. Obviously, as well, a lot more could be said, but for the sake of this kind of presentation, let's work with something like that. And I think that everything I just outlined is there's nothing objectionable to any of the lenses I've named, including the traditional devotional lens. I think that that captures something of the essence of the Christian tradition, which leads to the question now of how we metamodernize our conception of that tradition. And that's what I'd like to try to gesture to in just the broadest strokes as I kind of conceive of that. Um, so one of the first things I'd note about this sort of about the sacred history that we find, in the Bible is that it is one of sort of it follows a history of increasing scope, right? So you go back to the early patriarchs, and you've got a handful of people operating in sort of like a kind of tribal context, and then in time there's the development of this monarchy and this sort of rise of a national identity for the kingdom of Israel. And then from there, a further expansion into a sense of global importance, a global faith that reaches to the ends of the earth and indeed has sort of a cosmic significance. So this sort of sense of increasing scope, increasing levels of impact and embrace is, I think, is intrinsic to or inherent to the story itself. It's in the Bible, and you can chart that trajectory there. Um, and this unfolding relationship that sort of occurs throughout that expansion is one in which, as I said, the revelation of God about himself to man is one that is also changing and growing in such a way that I think you can imagine, or you can conceptualize this story as a way in which mankind is learning more about God, more about ultimate reality, more about the truth. Um, and and I think that that's a very kind of Christian way of understanding the tradition. So what I want to propose here is the idea that we read the Bible in this way as a record of sort of the learning process that humanity has undergone from, many thousands of years ago, uh, through time, in such a way that constitutes a sort of sacred unfolding and revelation, successively developing the reality or the conception of the reality of the divine to humanity. Um, I'll explain a little bit more at the end about why I think that that's an important framing if we want to approach this from a metamodern context, but I don't want to complicate things too much at the moment. But again, so far I think everything I've said is non-objectionable for many of the lenses that I've named, which is important. Okay, so if we want to approach this as a kind of learning process, right, that the arc that I just described is one in which mankind is learning more about God. Let's talk a little bit about learning first, then, right? What does that mean? How do we know when someone has learned more about something? That's actually a very important question, right? So it's not just that things change. It's not just that things are different than the way that they used to be. It's actually that there's a direction or a progression in thought in a non-arbitrary way. That's what we kind of mean by learning. And when we study learning, that takes actually certain forms that we can identify. There's certain patterns to learning, which again, much of this could be spelled out, and I will be spelling out in great detail in my book. But for now, just to kind of give a broad overview, this is an important and kind of crucial idea. So bear with me for a minute while I try to communicate something here that might seem a little bit, far afield, but actually I think is really essential for appreciating uh, the sacred history as a developmental sort of learning process. What we know about learning is that there's there's a process underway in which basically people assimilate or accommodate information as they experience it. Meaning, assimilation is when we have a certain category for something that is already familiar, and then we have an experience and we kind of just filter it through that pre-given category and it works, right? Okay, we've assimilated our experience to our kind of mental schema or category. Whereas accommodation is when we have an experience that doesn't fit nicely or neatly into a pre-existing category or sort of framework. And so we are forced to kind of update or develop a new concept or category to somehow capture this element of reality that we're experiencing. So assimilation is when you kind of integrate something into a pre-given frame, and accommodation is when you are kind of forced to change or adopt or take in a new frame, you could say. For example, like a kid, very young, might see a horse and they say, look, mommy, a cat, because they have a cat at home and that's the only kind of moving animal that they've ever seen. And the word for that, the category was cat. But this is not a cat, this is a horse. So the mother says, oh no, that's horse. And then the child learns the word for horse, which now is differentiated from cat. And and has uh, the child is now accommodated to something new in their experience, and they're able to now form a new category about something that allows them to relate to that more effectively. Now, you'd say that they've learned what a horse is, and this is kind of the essence of the learning process. We're always undergoing various forms of equilibrization or equilibrium with our environment relative to our assimilated categories, right? So next time child sees a horse, they already have that category. They just assimilate it. There it is. But maybe they see a rhinoceros next time, and then they've got to learn that, and so on and so forth, so that over time, our categories differentiate and they become more diverse. And this is the kind of expansion of our perspectives and our knowledge that occurs in this way. This is what is kind of the broad pattern of learning. Now, this is very important because when we're born, we have just like very simple familiar categories that come to us from our immediate environment, which is our family, which is the most immediate human relationships, and mother, father, what have you, and toy and this and that sort of a thing. And so the progression of learning is one in which we successively, over the lifespan, accommodate ourselves to more and more novel information by differentiating our kind of mental schemas for things in ways that wind up sort of moving us out of what is more immediately kind of familiar and familial and sort of the locus of kind of the kind of standard life world of like a rather parochial context, and it expands and it grows, right? And so we no longer hopefully assimilate experience to what is most immediately familiar about our experience, which is going to be, uh, anthropocentric, right? We learn to accommodate more to the nature of reality, and learn new terms for that and new ways of thinking. So this is the accommodation assimilation process that kind of characterizes learning. And this is important, I think, if we want to view the Bible or the Christian tradition through this lens. And I think that it's a very fascinating thing if and when we do. And is sort of the crux of the insight of a metamodern Christianity. So when we are accommodating, we are differentiating. When we are integrating, we are assimilating. And as John Vervaeke makes the point in his work, this is sort of the process of relevance realization, and this is the means by which the mind complexifies. Every time you get integration of differentiation, you get complexification. So learning is a complexification process, and you can actually rank one's learning progression by means of how complex the thought becomes over time, because you have more and more differentiated aspects becoming integrated. So we need to think about learning as a complexification process, which will become important down the road. Now, the sort of cutting edge in like learning theory is in these terms that we understand learning as complexification, and so the construct called hierarchical complexity is a way where you can actually measure this quantifiably. And I'll just note that in my own research, the preliminary findings that I found, which I think are fascinating and hypothesized, were confirmed that there is increasing hierarchical complexity through the different biblical materials. So I just want to throw that out, that some of what I'm going to be saying has some preliminary empirical data, but we can also understand this interpretively as well. The big framework I'd like to propose here, right, is that the story of sacred history that we read in the Bible can be understood as a learning process in light of what we know about assimilation and accommodation. What do I mean by that? So the kind of, for example, continual struggle that exists in the Old Testament between the prophets and the people who are always falling into idolatry and always creating new idols and pieces of wood as gods, and anthropomorphically representing the divine and all that the prophets and others find so problematic, is a struggle between higher and less high forms of complex thought, or you'd say, you know, relatively higher versus relatively lower complexity levels of thought, meaning that the process of thinking about and representing the divine is actually one in which you can view that through the lens of assimilation or accommodation. When we have very assimilatory ways of thinking about reality and God, we will represent that in terms of the categories that are familiar to us from, our kind of earlier learning processes. And so we tend to engage in things that Piaget called like the artificialism and animism. There's an anthropocentric and anthropomorphic way of representing and understanding reality. And all of these things relate to the fact that when you're a kid, right, when you're younger, when you're more immature, you're assimilating your experience of reality to yourself. So you're kind of projecting yourself onto reality, is another way of framing that. Whereas when you develop and you mature and you learn, and you have more highly complex thought, you're able to accommodate more to reality and see that not everything works the way people work. Some things are just naturalistic objects. Some things are simpler organisms. The sun doesn't follow you, right? And the when the clouds get gray, it's not because they're mad, right? All the kind of anthropomorphic and animistic projection that happens in sort of earlier forms of thought are representative of an early stage in the learning process. And you can understand the theological developments that we read in the Christian tradition as essentially progressing through that same arc. And as we move from that scope of sort of that kind of local tribal worship of of spirits through altars and shrines and high places and that sort of a thing, into kind of an imperial polytheistic context where there's the kind of cultic stories that get celebrated in the temple and have a direct relationship to the palace and its royal ideology, a kind of imperial ideology of force and warriors and this sort of a thing, on into the axial age, where you get the development of deeper kind of moral sensitivities and inwardness, and the idea of a kind of rich inner life that has a moral component, and the kind of deepening of consciousness that occurs in that. All these things actually map very well to a certain kind of developmental progression that we see in the learning process. Briefly, I'll just note, and again, a lot more could be said about this, but probably won't get into this right now, but this has an individual component and a collective component, right? The work of James Fowler and other people like him who studied faith development have shown that when you kind of look at people's conception of the divine through a kind of Piagetian or developmental learning lens, you see a progression from sort of strongly anthropomorphic, kind of animistic, intuitive, projective forms of faith towards more rational, abstract, and kind of naturalistic forms of faith. But essentially that this same learning process plays out at the level of culture. And, highly recommend the work of Jürgen Habermas on all that point, that understanding sort of social development as a learning process, and one that also leads towards what Habermas would call like post-metaphysical thinking, which essentially is kind of writ large what people experience at the individual level of moving from very kind of magical, animistic, anthropomorphic, mythological thinking to more abstract, rational thought. So bold claims here, but the claim that I'd like to sort of further, which won't be surprising for a lot of people who are familiar with my work and the broader metamodern and integral community, et cetera, is that a properly kind of metamodern approach to Christianity would be one that saw this progression in the tradition itself and took that very seriously, right? So how do we see playing out in the sacred history, in the progressive revelation of God to humanity, a version of man learning more about the divine in such a way that it follows these patterns of basically moving from assimilatory to more accommodation perspectives, right? Less and less projection of myself onto nature, of making God in my image, right? And more kind of conforming to reality as I'm experiencing it, and experiencing, you could even say, God as God is, less as I am imagining. One of the things that I am doing in this book with great detail, but can only touch the surface of here, is going through the Bible and looking at the different shifting conceptions of the divine, from sort of the earliest, patriarchal era into the sort of kingdom era, and then on into the kind of prophetic period and the time of Jesus, ultimately into modernity and postmodernity and now metamodernity, with an eye to the evolving nature of the sacred, uh, and understanding that in terms of a learning process. Briefly, I mean, because I think people watching this will probably be coming with a deep understanding of the Bible and the Christian tradition. I'll just note a couple things to kind of give you a sense of what I mean by this, right? So, let's start with like the patriarchal period, and you've got Abraham and Jacob and Isaac and Joseph, and they're essentially existing in a tribal context. Where there's no centralization of worship, and for example, Jacob has a vision somewhere at Bethel, and so he erects this like sacred standing stone there as sort of a memorial to that. There's a kind of shifting between these sacred sites of Shiloh and Bethel and Shechem and these places. And at these places, individuals can sort of have these dreams or these visions, right? These like direct encounters with something numinous. And here you also get the fear of God, the fear of the divine. Highly recommend the works of like Rudolf Otto on this point, right? That there's a profound, deep sense of the numinous encounter that you find in these works, especially in the kind of patriarchal period and that strata of texts, right? And that's just what characterizes the relationship between God and man at that time. That the form that revelation took, let's just say, in the Christian tradition, in this part of sacred history, was essentially one in which individuals had these sort of sudden numinous experiences, visions, dreams, and that there was a sense of profound porousness between like the individual consciousness and then like this, rapturous, numinous encounter that might be filled with like a profound awe or dread or what have you. And that's very characteristic of these kinds of like of a particular stage in the learning process. Now, after this period, when you get the establishment of the monarchy and you get the creation of ancient Israel as a kind of kingdom in the ancient Near East with a palace and a temple complex, and priests and scribes and all this, the nature of the divine revelation is very different. So God has now called for a temple to be made, for him. Solomon follows off of the work of David and does that. And of course, the Ark of the Covenant gets brought into the temple, and the tent of meeting becomes this like great structure that then Solomon, expands to these incredible heights. And now God is worshipped in the temple in a direct relationship with a kind of royal apparatus, if that makes sense, right? So now, akin to other ways that folks in the ancient Near East used to worship, there was a kind of like divinely sanctioned king, and he had certain priests, and there was a certain set of rites and sacrifices. And this is now the nature of the divine relationship. And a different conception of God now takes place, or evolves, you could say, right? Before, God was kind of, a benefactor of some kind, and he was sort of a kind of like a supporter of kin, or like the deity for like a particular lineage, and one who supported the patriarchs, right, in their flourishing and developing their lineages. Now he becomes the divine warrior. At least this is what we see represented, at this strata and in this stage of the divine relationship. So you read the Psalms, most of which are sort of like the direct liturgical materials of the temple during the heyday of ancient Israelite nation, and the predominant framework or vision of the divine is one as a divine warrior who goes out and battles and fights for the king and protects the king and fights the enemies, and this sort of a thing. And so it's a very different conception of the divine, but it's a further, you could say, development of that human God relationship that now exists. And this is, again, like largely based in ritual. It's about like the particular rites of the temple. And if you read the law codes in the Bible, and the different like Leviticus and Deuteronomy and whatnot, these are kinds of law codes that refer to sort of proper worship relative to specific ritual activity, ablution, purification, sacrifice, etc. Right? And this is the kind of relationship that mankind has with God. That's sort of the essence of it. And this is what begins to shift in a profound way with the rise of the prophets and with the rise of this axial age, so called, where you start to see people think of God in an even deeper way, where God starts to reveal, actually, I don't care so much about the incense and the rites and the purifications. What I care about is your soul. What I care about is what's inside you. How do you treat the oppressed, the widow, the orphan? And so you see in the kind of prophetic tradition this emphasis increasingly on moral purity as a more abstract notion of what kind of ritual purity is, right? So you get this idea that winds up getting rationalized and abstracted into a more immaterial kind of conception that has a profound moral implication, and that God doesn't care about the particular, legalities. He cares about more of the spirit of the law rather than the letter of the law. And this is, a core aspect of Jesus's message by the time we get to the New Testament, right? Most of Jesus's conflicts with the sort of religious establishment of his time is around these sorts of issues. Was the Sabbath made for man or man for the Sabbath, and this sort of a thing. He keeps getting the kind of brunt of a particular sort of legalistic, ritualistic approach to religion, and he tries to respond with the fact that no, like it's what's on the inside that counts. It's not about necessarily like how much money you give to the temple. It's about how fervently you pray. It's not just about committing adultery. It's actually about like lusting in your heart after people. So much of the message of Jesus is a continuation of this sort of like axial age style prophetic tradition, which is it's much more about the inward nature of the relationship between God and man. And this is just a profound change in the kinds of conceptions of the divine, and it is a development and a deepening of that relationship into just a profoundly new register. Now, there's a lot that could be said in really fascinating ways about how different aspects of the previous tradition wind up getting reimagined in the new one, right? So, like, for example, God in the imperial tradition used to be the divine warrior who would go out and fight, like the draconic sea monster, right? Essentially Leviathan, and Israel's enemies and that sort of a thing. Whereas in the axial age, this gets sort of projected with kind of cosmic implications into this divine battle with evil, with Satan, who's now the dragon, who falls from heaven, and this sort of a thing. And this will become interesting in a minute, which when we move into the modern period. But I just want to stop for the moment and just consider the profound successive stages of revelation that this story, the sacred history, then is gesturing towards, of one in which sort of the divine is increasingly less anthropomorphized in the sense of projecting, the immediate assimilatory categories of the mind onto things, and becomes much more abstract and sort of mentalized and internalized and made more about the conscious experience in a particular kind of relational and moral depth. And of course, the whole prophetic tradition is also strongly harsh against idols, right? The whole notion is that no, we don't just do what these pagans do with their idols of representing these things anthropomorphically or as animals. That's all silly stuff, right? What we do is we relate to the real God, and we do that by means of like deeper interiority. And so, yeah, a lot more could be said about this, but again, this is just broad strokes. But the big point here is that sacred history, in a sense that I feel like is very at home with very traditional notions still of Christianity, is a progressive revelation of a deepening relationship with God between man, in a story that is leading humanity closer into contact with the reality of the divine, of moving from separation to communion. And as that's happening, things become less concrete, they become more abstract, they become less sort of physical and kind of idolatrously materialistic, and more interior, conceptual, mentalistic, more moral, etc. And this is perceived as the deepening of the relationship between humanity and God. Now, what I would posit then, and I don't think it's also that radical to say, is that we can understand this process is actually continuing beyond, let's say, the first century AD, in the sense that God, presumably, continues to keep working in history, which again I don't think is a particularly radical idea, even for especially for traditional devotional approaches to Christianity. So the notion then is that God continues to work. God still is active in the world, and in this sense, then humanity continues to deepen its understanding and its relationship to God, and certainly its understanding of the world and how and the nature of creation, right? So, by the time we get to like the early modern period, you've got folks like Galileo saying that there's like, sort of like two books of reality. One is scripture, but the other is sort of the book of nature, which is written in the language of mathematics, as he said. And you start to see this notion that reality can be understood in certain kinds of naturalistic terms in a way that reveals the profound grandeur and beauty and sublimity and majesty of creation, right? Like learning is still going on. And when we look at reality and we develop science and we begin to learn about protons and neutrons and, the workings of cells and biology, all of these things are revealing something more about the nature of reality and hence creation and hence the divine in a way that's still ongoing beyond, beyond, let's say, the last book of the Bible, not in a purely analogous way, right? Obviously, there's something special, especially in the traditional devotional lens, about scripture and the particular mode of that revelation. But now you're starting to get a different kind of revelation come into the process through a different sort of deepening of the learning process. And here, I think is actually where a lot of people, if what I've said sounds a bit uncomfortable, just think about the transformation of Christian conceptions through the work of like Jordan Peterson, right? And all the kind of influence that tradition, say that Jungian tradition and folks drawing on, like Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey and all of that, all the depth, the psychological depth that brings out of the texts and understanding all these deep things going on, all that's a very modern hermeneutical approach of taking these texts and then looking for that kind of, information there. And it's very interesting, right? Because all that I've said about like, the divine warrior fighting the dragon and then the sort of cosmic battle with the dragon and all that, right? Peterson's great on this point about connecting that to the Jungian archetypes of order and chaos. If you've read Maps of Meaning, for instance, most of that analysis is really spot on for appreciating the deep psychological aspect of what's going on in those stories. But what you'll understand, though, is that this basic story, let's say the hero myth who fights with the dragon and overcomes it and creates the world, goes through a series of progressive deepenings and sort of reinterpretations in such a way that what had been sort of a mythic tale, right, of like fighting a dragon, then becomes this cosmic tale of, the war between good and evil, and then becomes in this modern context this story of the unconscious being sort of severed by the individuating hero who kind of emerges from the Ouroboros and sort of asserts themselves and becomes a full self and the deepening of consciousness that's all meant to represent. And obviously, Jordan Peterson's drawing deeply on the work of Erich Neumann and the whole history and evolution of consciousness, and of course the whole Jungian tradition, etc. But what we see, though, right, is that there's this shift in register now, that these stories take on a kind of deeply symbolic and archetypal significance in a way that was different in the kind of earlier, let's say imperial or even the axial interpretations. So there's a deepening of the learning process. And in fact, as you see also that even this basic narrative itself is about learning, right? I mean, again, as Peterson emphasizes a lot, that this is about the heroic individual going into uncharted territory and coming back from that chaos with a new sense of order that they can sort of replenish the world with, right? So it's a going forth into the unknown and coming back from it in such a way with the pearl of great price that can further enhance and deepen the state of the world, which is the learning process, which is going into the unknown and rendering it known and improving existence thereby. So in all of these iterations, there's the same basic kind of archetypal story, the same basic kind of pattern, you could say, of this learning process underway that even the myths have been about in some kind of meta mythic way or monomythic way, as Campbell would call it. And that this process then continues through modernity and into these new forms of conceptualizing of sacred history and what these stories are about. And that this is a continually expanding notion of the divine. It's a continually growing and more encompassing vision, right? So that the notion, the way of Jesus when he shows up and he says, no, 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 it's not about the rite, it's not about the ritual, it's about what's in your heart, right? That's an expanded view. The whole vision of the Good Samaritan is like, who's my neighbor, right? Well, it used to be in the kind of like just concrete operational sensibility of, well, it's literally my neighbor or it's literally, the person in my community. There's an expansion of that concept into sort of the neighbor is a spiritual concept. It's one who it's one who engages in agape. It's one who loves the other, and whoever can extend that grace and that love to their fellow man. That's a deepening of the conception of neighbor and of other, etc. And I guess what's fascinating to me is that you can follow this logic into modernity and beyond it, such that by the time you get to, say, postmodernity, right, you're starting to see the way of Jesus expanded even more, right? So that even maybe traditional notions of who was my neighbor, which maybe was Christians, is now expanded to include all faiths. It's expanded to include and to be particularly concerned about the marginalized and who's being left out of the story or oppressed. So the whole notion, the axial age notion of the taking care of the widow and the oppressed and the orphan and the alien winds up sort of reaching a global perspective in a kind of postmodern world. And I guess what I want to make the claim for here is that this is the learning process that we see. It's the same one in the individual collective process unfolding through sacred history, but it doesn't stop. It doesn't end, with the book of Revelation. It goes on into the modern period and into the postmodern period with this successive expansion of moral regard, moral concern, and also an expansion of the understanding of reality and how it works and what nature's causes are, and a deepening accommodation to reality, not just the assimilatory wanting to kind of convert everything into one's own familiar notions of things, but actually a grappling with what is in a way that's often sometimes uncomfortable, but still upgrades our understanding of reality. It's a learning, it's a going into the chaos and coming back with something new. And it's a perpetual fighting of that dragon and getting separated from it and individuating from it and growing and transforming and transcending, right? And this is basically the story that you can understand Christianity itself as articulating, not just in its ancient scriptures, though it's certainly there, but also as it continues throughout the Christian tradition into the modern and the postmodern periods. So, I would argue a metamodern Christianity would then look back on all of this, all these different modes that this has taken over sacred history, and relate its current conception of these things to them in such a way that it positions itself as sort of the current instantiation of a lineage that has gone through multiple iterations and developments and a sort of stage-like progression to the current state of that progressive revelation of God in history. All of these were sort of necessary movements or moments in the life of the tradition that led from maybe more immature, from our perspective, conceptions to more mature ones. When we look back on the old, making shrines era of the God-man revelation, that might seem quaint. And in fact, in the biblical tradition itself, older versions actually wind up getting outlawed, right? So like by the time you get to, I think it's Deuteronomy, right? Like all the high places, those aren't allowed anymore. There's a notion that like earlier forms of religious faith and expression have sort of served their time and are sort of not the new ideal way of expressing the human divine relationship. And so these get codified and these get sort of instantiated in tradition and in the kind of institutions of the church and the different ideas that get carried forward. And that is ultimately a learning process. And so a metamodern Christianity is one in which one that is the inheritor of this long line of historical learning. It's the inheritor of the long line of progressive revelation of the divine and the deepening of the relationship and understanding of ultimate reality. Um, and and that it's also one that recognizes its own sort of incompleteness as well, because once you're aware of that process underway in history, you recognize that this is an ongoing process. This is a developmental one. And so we're just in one mode of that, but there will be others after that will continue. And I guess the last thing I'll say on that front is a new conception, I think, a little bit of the role that humanity plays, in the life of the divine, if you want to even put it that way, which is that uh, what is the relationship between man and God in this sense? Is it just that? Is it just basically humans sort of placate the kind of numinous forces out of fear and dread, and maybe trying to make use of them through magical means? Well, that was a sort of tribal way that relationship expressed itself. Is it a sort of a ritualistic, sacrificial, sort of purificatory relationship that has to happen by means of priests and liturgies and kind of complex, rituals and whatnot? Well, that was sort of an imperialistic conception of that, when there were like, temples and palaces and whatnot. Or is this a more kind of moral, deep, interpersonal and sort of conscious inward relationship that exists as you start to see really flourish in the message of the prophets and the moral visions of the prophets and Jesus, of course, and the vision of reality as being sons of God, and being in communion with each other in a family, a sacred family, and having Christ as sort of your brother, right? In this sort of profoundly deepened emotional relationship. Well, that's, as I said, that kind of instantiation of it. But maybe it also continues to expand in such a way that we see that the stories themselves have symbolic import in such a manner that only maybe loosely sometimes maps onto the mechanistic forces that are um, underneath the fabric of reality that the learning process continues to unveil to humanity and reveal more deeply the nature and the mechanics of creation. Maybe that learning process is deepening there, where we start to see that there are natural forces and laws working in reality. Maybe the study of scripture itself, as it transforms in the modern historical critical lens, is a new way, a new set of tools, a new relationship that can be drawn out of the text, revealing new insights and a deepening of the understanding of the divine. And in fact, I would say very much it is, because all of that is needed in order to fully paint in the kind of picture that I'm describing, and to go back and see, oh, versus J had different conceptions of the divine, but that maps to these different periods of the different revelatory relationship, etc. So you need that historical critical lens to kind of fill in the picture here, right? But you also then need to transcend also beyond that to start to understand that that's not the absolute frame, that there's a kind of insight of the postmodern sociological socialization, social constructivist angle of the participatory knowing aspect of reality, and all that brings with it. And eventually, all of these things work together cumulatively to provide a vision in which all of sacred history is not just bounded within a particular text, but actually expands into the nature of all of known history. All of reality itself is a cosmic learning process. The way that, for example, Bobby Azarian talks about it in his work, and the explanation of a universe that inherently unfolds and develops and evolves by means of meaningful information that is increasingly learned with greater complexity, so that this whole sacred history that we think of as the relationship between God and man is set within a very broad cosmic vision of a cosmic learning process. These are the sorts of ways that I think that the metamodern lens can draw on all the different modalities, the traditional, the modern, the postmodern, to paint a really cosmic picture in which we are participating and on the threshold of a new kind of conception of the divine, that we ourselves are also in some ways called to be um, prophetic voices of, right? That we are participating still in the unfolding of history, and that God is still at work in history, and that the God concept itself is evolving, and it finds its evolutionary expression by means of us, that we are the body of Christ, the hands of Christ, that we are rendering expressions of that new conception possible, and that there's something I think profoundly beautiful in the idea that that is the service that we offer to the divine, no longer in sacrifice, no longer even in a certain kind of sort of inward sacrifice or asceticism, but that almost in that Jungian sense of the service that we do to God is through our consciousness itself and through our own expansion and evolution of consciousness. Not in some wooey magical way, but in the way that is documented throughout history, and that we are then stepping into as we progress through history still into new forms of consciousness, new paradigms, new worldviews, such that all of this creates the conception in which we inhabit a worldview of worldviews, and that the story in which those worldviews unfold and evolve is sacred history. So that more or less would be just a quick way to try to express my conception of what a metamodern Christianity looks like. Obviously, there may be many, many other kinds of ways that that looks, but for me, that's essentially it. So hopefully that explains a bit more why I feel like all of this leads to a perspective that needs to deeply appreciate not just the scripture of tradition, but also modernity and science, naturalism, and the insights of physics and biology, sociology, and all the new insights. All that we've learned is still actually part of the unfolding of the revelation of reality, and to take all that seriously, and to take also the postmodern seriously in its things that we've learned, and the ways that our understanding itself is shaped by context, and the ways that we can become more expansive and more open to the other and to the marginal, etc. All of that is a learning process, and one that I see ties all the way back into traditional conceptions of the divine, but is about the transformation of the conception of the divine. So, if we get stuck in a particular conception, particular mode, a particular form of representation, we become stuck with an idol. And there's a great book by Jean-Luc Marion called God Without Being that really explores this, the conceptual idolatry that we're prone to. And so the nature of the death and resurrection of the divine, which Jesus enacts, can be understood in a very profound way as a continual death and resurrection, a continual dying and rising God that we have to be open to as it continually shifts and transforms as this progressive revelation unfolds and develops, and that we are ourselves participatory, indeed the sort of mouthpiece for the new forms that that takes. And that is a service that we can render to the evolving God. I find all of that to be a very spiritually fulfilling, psychologically fulfilling, profound notion of faith, and one that I think a metamodern Christianity could successively adopt and further and develop both new rituals and psychotechnologies and monastic and other kinds of institutional contexts to harbor and cultivate, but also use the medium of the past and the tradition and the story to see itself in, to articulate itself through. That all the symbols and the images are there for this to speak itself through them. And in that sense, keep alive in a very profound way the traditional devotional lens as well, and all that it brings with it, but to contextualize it and to relate it and to coordinate it with the other modalities and the other worldviews and the other perspectives in such a way that doesn't absolutize it as being the ultimate end and final answer, which metamodernism, again, to stress, is not either, but only one movement or moment in, I guess, what Hegel might have called the life of spirit, but which is continuing to grow and change and evolve. All right, I'll leave it there. So yeah, would love to get any general reflections on this very general perspective. But wanted to put this out there so that people had a bit more context for how I'm thinking about these things and where I'm coming at them from, without having an overly limited sense of, where my thought is based on any given conversation, or what particular dialectical tension might be explored in a particular moment. So thanks for listening. Hope to get your thoughts. And while I continue to heal and engage these sorts of topics more in a video way and less in writing, I look forward to doing more of these sorts of real-time YouTube videos and that sort of a thing, and to engaging with the kinds of feedback as we explore Christianity in this moment of the God pivot. So Godspeed, everyone.